out of all the things that could define the medieval period, one of the things that defines it the most is probably feudalism, which is a system of government that really organized most of the states during the medieval period in Europe. So it's not really technically a system of government because that implies that there's an entire country, right? It's more of like a system that was based heavily on local administrative control, which looked like a landowner, which is in this case would be the lord, gave fiefs, a unit of land, to people with promises of military and legal protection in return for payment for that land. So the person who ended up paying the lords would become the vassal of that land, and they basically controlled the entirety of it for a price, of course, from that lord. And the people who served under the vassals were serfs, the people, the peasants. Now, they technically were on this social calendar that we would probably call a pyramid, right? They were very much below the vassals, right? And this is where we really start to see social stratification in the West, right? So, like, although social stratification itself had been present in other societies, the stratifications of medieval society between feudal lords and the various vassals across countries often led to wars among the lords of the same country. And you can see this later on during the Hundred Years' War, and even internal wars between the Normans after the death of Henry the Conqueror, right? And probably one of the most famous things to come out of the medieval period, and especially come out of the system of feudalism, is the Magna Carta. As we know, this is a foundational document of rights given to noblemen by King John in 1215. Now, that's one thing I have to specify. It is only for nobles. During this time, nobles were the only ones who were given these types of rights. Now, later on, the Magna Carta would inspire other things, such as the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France, right? But it is you do have to acknowledge that it is only for noblemen during that time. And so,
the rise and fall of the church kind of sounds boring. To be honest, it's really not that bad. Even though the church never really fell, just kind of got split up. But where did it start? Well, you kind of have to go back to like around like the year 750-ish, 800 AD, when the Franks ended up taking Rome back from the Lombards. And they contacted the Pope and they're like, hey, yo, do you want to make your headquarters here in Rome? And the Pope was like, yeah, let's go ahead and do it. You had the formation of the Papal States. Yippee. Then you kind of go into this like part of like when the Pope really turned into this like powerful leader in Europe and really all around the world. And they've developed these things called papal bulls. And basically they're like, you know, the United States kind of ripped this off in a way, I think, where you have these like small executive orders, but they're called papal bulls. And basically what it was is the Pope could just make a statement and make a claim about anything, and bam, there you go. And this kind of leads us to a really powerful, like, and I'm not going to say evil Pope, but it was a dude that, like, he was not afraid to, like, step in front of, like, any of these leaders all across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And that's Pope Boniface. And Boniface, he had a mouth on him. He really, really, really wanted to just make a claim. And so he had a ton of papal bulls. And a lot of them really weren't that important. But the one thing that got really ugly was when him and a king ended up getting in a fight, because this king was like, yo, dude, I'm going to start taxing your people. And Pope Boniface is like, no, you're not. He's like, yeah, I am. I'm going to tax you, and I'm going to tax everybody for living in my area. And the Pope was like, yeah, no, the hell you aren't. It's kind of really all you need to know with Pope Boniface. It wasn't too serious. Whatever. But it kind of leads us into the Great Schisms. These Great Schisms are kind of weird because they're kind of just like all over the place. You had one Great Schism that happened when the church split from the Eastern Church and created the Eastern Orthodox Church, and you had like Constantinople and all those other cities like kind of involved, whatever. And it was just like, hey, we can't use the use of like these religious images, and we can't, you know, look at them, and we can't worship them because that's not what the church believes in. And the Eastern Orthodox Church was like, okay, later. So they kind of just like peaced. And then it was like, another one was like, I don't like this word in the Nicene Creed. Well, I like this word in the Nicene Creed, but I don't. But I do. Go back and forth. Whatever. And then my favorite one was the dispute over the Western churches, because you had one pope that was like, "Yo, I'm the pope. No, I'm the pope." And another one was like, "No, I'm the pope." No one really knew who the pope was, but it kind of reminds me of this one Family Guy scene.
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
That guy's Spartacus.
Then you kind of had this situation where everybody just started excommunicating each other. Where I was like, you know what? I don't think you belong in the church. Get out. So the Pope was just excommunicate you, excommunicate you, excommunicate you. They did it to each other. When you had these three people that were like, yeah, I'm the Pope. No, I'm the Pope. That's the Pope. Whatever. They're like, you know what? We're going to excommunicate you. But no, we're going to excommunicate you. And basically, all it was kicking you out of the church. Didn't really mean anything, but whatever.
The Silk Road and the bubonic plague. So, the Silk Road was established by Han China in 130 BCE and went to roughly 1453 CE. It was 4,000 miles long, and it went from China, the very edge on the Pacific, to the Mediterranean Sea. On this road, people exchanged ideas, people exchanged religion, people exchanged silk, gold, spices, everything you can imagine. Unfortunately, they didn't know what all they were sharing. The Mongols made it their own, but warfare, gross conditions will lead to this, the bubonic plague. So what is the bubonic plague? It is a bacteria caused by regurgitated flea blood. Sounds hilarious, it's not. Unfortunately, in 1347 CE onward to 1351, Europe was decimated by this. Although it started in China and spread through all the corners of the world, essentially, nothing could stop this. There was no science to potentially stop it. People believed that it wasn't the rats, it wasn't the fleas, it wasn't the cats or the dogs that they killed, which actually may have helped them. No, they believed it was miasmas. Miasmas, in their terms, it's kind of what you would think a germ was before the term germ existed. They thought it was these vapors that you would get from bad smells, and like, oh, you smell something bad? Oh, whoops, you have the plague. Needless to say, plague doctors stuffed masks, they stuffed gloves, everything to keep them from touching plague victims. This kind of helped, but they didn't know the science behind it. Regardless, it was a pseudoscience, and millions of people died. Roughly about 30 to 80% of human populations decimated because of this thing that they had no knowledge of. To this day, you go to Europe, you will see statues dedicated to the dead because so many people were lost in this pandemic. And I'm grateful today, having lived through a pandemic myself, knowing that we're alive.
In the near millennia of history to cover in this teak, there was almost constant conflict, ranging from small tribes arguing over borders to a series of religious crusades that drew fighters from multiple continents. In the interest of time, I'll only be going over some of the biggest and most influential ones. One of the earliest empires to rise after the fall of the Romans was under Charlemagne, a Frankish or French king with big ambitions who rose to power in 768. In 772, he began a 32-year-long war with the Saxons, appropriately named the Saxon Wars, in what is now Germany. Following his long-awaited victory, Charlemagne almost doubled the size of the Carolingian Empire and kickstarted the dynasty. However, it broke apart following his death when he decided to split the empire among his sons, which led to the creation of the modern countries of France and Germany. A couple hundred years later, in 1066, the Norman conquest brings England back onto the world stage when William the Conqueror, the Frankish Duke of Normandy, led an invasion across the Channel. William had a tenuous claim to the English throne and took advantage of the infighting over its vacancy to throw his name into the ring and defeat King Harold at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And while it took him almost a decade to take the rest of the country, there was little doubt of his inevitable victory. In order to protect his new kingdom, William built defensive castles all across the land and placed his most trusted vassals in charge of them. Although, in an attempt to keep them from rebelling against him, the conqueror often tried to place enemies right next to each other. This also marked a rise in feudalism in Western Europe. Finally, the Crusades. 9 major campaigns plus a dozen smaller attempts over 2 centuries of conflict to retake the Holy Land. However, half of them didn't even make it out of Europe. The First Crusade was announced in 1095 by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont, and within a year, Crusaders were gathering in force and setting off to fight the infidels. Many of these early Crusaders never left Europe and instead massacred thousands of the Jews in the Rhinelands of Germany out of false teaching, which sadly would be repeated again several times during the era. All of the Crusades encountered major problems with supply lines, betrayal, sickness, and transportation, in addition to a tendency to go crusading and conquering in the wrong countries. While the Holy Lands were taken and lost several times throughout the 200 years, one of the only things they ultimately accomplished was the transmission of knowledge and trade between the East and the West.